Hi there, this is episode 78 of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. In this edition, my guest is Yulia Oleinik, the head of UNICEF's office here in Czechia. UNICEF has been deeply involved in efforts to help provide education, accommodation, and other services to Ukrainian families who've ended up here after the Russians invaded their homeland. And I discuss their organization's work and much, much more with Yulia Oleinik in this edition of Prague Talk. My first question, Yulia, what's your own background? Where are you from?
So I'm from Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan is a nomadic country, and I think in that spirit I also have lived over the past 20 years in different countries, in the United States, then back to Central Asia for 5 years, and now I'm in Prague, working on supporting government and partners in responding to the refugee crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine.
And you yourself are Ukrainian, is that correct?
That's right. My last name is certainly Ukrainian. My family moved to Kazakhstan a year before I was born from Ukraine. So for me, this issue is certainly personal as well.
And was there a Ukrainian community or minority in Kazakhstan?
Yes, quite. Kazakhstan was and it remains quite international and multi-ethnic in many ways because of Stalin's policies. But also during Soviet times, there were a lot of movements of people between republics for work, for other reasons.
About work, how did you end up in your field?
So I think this experience of growing up as adolescent on the ruins of Soviet Union and seeing the society finding a new way and learning to live in a new reality was truly transformative for me, both as adolescent but also observing what my parents and community had to go through. So I got very interested in the questions of international development, democracy, values, and economic transformation. So then I went to study in the United States, international development, as well as in the UK, and that brought me to United Nations. In 2006, I joined the United Nations to work on development programs, and most recently with UNICEF.
And when did you take over in Prague?
July 2022, so nearly a year ago.
I presume, it's before you started there, but I presume your office's work was completely transformed on the 24th of February last year.
That's right. And obviously, we have a very strong partnership and presence in Ukraine. So we had a system there to quickly scale up a response to the crisis for children and families of Ukraine. But obviously, very quickly, it spilled over to many European countries. And UNICEF responded by opening temporary presence in several countries, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. We also already had presence in countries like Bulgaria, Moldova, that were also affected, and supporting children and families on the move with their basic needs first, and now with the longer-term agenda of inclusion.
So what exactly is UNICEF doing here in Czechia for Ukrainian refugee children?
We work very closely with the government, with civil society partners, to make sure that children and families fleeing the war in Ukraine have access to services, health, education, social protection, child protection, so that they have support they need to stand on their feet, integrate in society, and start contributing to society as well. Obviously, questions like education are quite complex because you have a large child population arriving in a very short time. And education system and Ministry of Education have done an outstanding work over the past few months, basically over a year, in integrating children. Over 50,000 Ukrainian refugee children are now in the education system, which is incredible in such a short time. And without prior experience, it greatly contributes to making the system more inclusive. But of course, at the back end of it, there were a lot of efforts in supporting teachers, supporting school administration, as well as the ministry on how to work in this new reality. Let me give you a specific example. We work with the Ministry of Education on training teachers on how to teach in a more heterogeneous environment, how to identify signs of stress and trauma, and how to address them, how to refer children to support they need. We've also supported the ministry in hiring and building capacity of teaching assistants, both from Ukraine and Czech Republic, to work alongside teachers and support children in understanding curriculum, in understanding material, in integrating with the classmates, so that they can have better learning outcomes and so that they are supported in terms of their mental health.
According to UNICEF's figures, there are now more than 90,000 Ukrainian child refugees in Czechia. I presume quite often you meet these kids. You talk about stress and their mental state. Typically, what kind of mental state do they have?
It varies depending on how long people have been here and what they've experienced. I think for any child experiencing war and fleeing the war with such a huge uncertainty will have a big impact. And we see it with all ages, starting with small children. We supported Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs in opening new children's groups throughout Czech Republic. Now there are 67 that we supported, so that children can continue developing, so that mothers can actually join the labor market, and so that they are supported from their mental health perspective. What we see in the first days, teachers were telling us that every time they would hear a sharp sound, they would go under the tables, because it just, based on their earlier experience. But with time and with the right support, they start smiling, they start playing together, and they're getting their childhood back. But then it's very different for adolescents that came in this very fragile time for anyone when you are turning from childhood to adulthood, from education to employment. It's a difficult time it could be a difficult time for any one of us, but when you are displaced, when you are taken out of your community, when you had to flee your home, your school, your friends, it's many times more difficult. And what we see is often they are lost. They don't know what the future holds. They don't know if they'll stay here long or when and how they can go back. And so supporting them in this period is very important, providing with psychosocial support. And it's does not necessarily mean psychologists or psychologists only. Often small things like having a peer, having a Czech peer, or having a place to come to and engage in a conversation and a board game. Feeling welcomed in school goes a long way in improving mental health and support for adolescents, but also helping them to regain sense of hope and aspiration, that displacement does not need to spell the end of their dreams, and that even in a new environment, they can continue pursuing their education, they can continue exploring employment opportunities.
Is it the case that with younger children, there's quite a high level of attendance in schools, but when they get a bit older, there's much less attendance?
That's very much the case. So while we know that over 90% of Ukrainian refugee children have been integrated in the primary school age, which is really incredible achievement by international standards. And I think this is where we really need to acknowledge this effort by the Czech Republic. When it comes to secondary school, it's no longer mandatory. So only 46% of Ukrainian refugee adolescents are attending school. And the big question of what are the other half doing? Some of them are following Ukrainian curriculum, some of them are working so that they can support themselves here and families back at home. Some of them are trying to combine both. But again, it raises questions of protection, questions of support. We know that many of these adolescents are here on their own. without their parents, and we work very closely with the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs in identifying those young people, making sure that their cases are managed by social workers and that they get support that they need, connecting them to education, connecting them to health services they need or protection.
There's been quite a bit in the news recently about a change to the law that governs the stay of Ukrainian refugees in Czechia that's coming in just in a very short period at the beginning of July. What exactly is changing?
You're referring to Lex Ukraine 5, and that is a fifth iteration of Lex Ukraine legislation that governs benefits and support to refugee population. And what we see with Lex Ukraine 5, there will be the rules around eligibility for accommodation and humanitarian benefits will be much stricter, both in terms of the time that people can access it as well as the amounts. So the general position of the government has been in supporting refugees to become self-reliant, and that is obviously important both for refugees as well as for the government. And we know that 100,000 refugees are already in the formal employment in Czech Republic. Again, incredible achievement. At the same time, we need to make sure that the most vulnerable groups do not fall through the cracks with this legislation. It is quite complex, both in terms of calculations as well as eligibility criteria. So we are working with partners, monitoring very closely what does it mean for children, for families, and that we make sure that vulnerable groups such as children with disabilities, unaccompanied and separated children, families from Roma community do not fall through the cracks.
Recently, there was a case of bullying that got a lot of attention. A young girl from Ukraine was spat at and pushed by these Czech kids who said pro-Russian things. And later, the young girl was met by the president in a kind of symbolic moment. Is that common?
There are cases we hear about. It's certainly not a commonplace, but it is important that these cases are addressed. UNICEF welcomes and commends President for making the statement and gesture that he did. I think it's important for that child, but it's also important for every child to see and to hear that there's no place for bullying and for violence in society. And it's important that we continue supporting a sense of social cohesion in schools, in society. We saw an unprecedented sense of solidarity and cohesion early on when the conflict just started. As conflict became more protracted, we see that solidarity is going down in society. And it is important that we continue supporting peaceful coexistence of communities. It's important that we demonstrate that refugees also, if supported, can stand on their feet, contribute to society. And this is really what Czech Republic has done, really reflects some of the best of humanity. And it's important that we do not go back and don't lose that progress.
If I could ask you one more question about yourself, you being Ukrainian, how has it been for you to see your people here in these difficult situations going through this awful experience and time?
I think it's difficult to see no matter what your background is. And also as UNICEF staff, organization that stands for children's rights around the world, I feel very committed to supporting every child in making sure that they have support, services they need to continue developing, thriving. I think also ultimately we need to look beyond the current situation. These young people are probably the biggest hope that Ukraine has for its rebuilding, and investing in their well-being and development now means also thinking of longer-term Ukraine.
This has been episode 78 of Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. There are, of course, literally scores more editions where this one came from. Why not listen to a few of them and subscribe wherever you get podcasts. But for me, Ian Willoughby, thank you so much for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again soon.